I sold this Ryobi trimmer almost 3 years ago to a coworker and it's finally come back to me. I hate to say it, but it looks the same as the day I gave it to them. Now, even though it looks the same, the problem it has now is much different from the last time I saw it, and I think I have a pretty good idea what it's been doing for all those years. In today's video, we look at this Ryobi trimmer, and the problem is that it won't start. Now, I'm not a big fan of Ryobi equipment, but this one is one of their better products, and the reason is very simple: its size. When talking about small engines, displacement is very important, and at 30 cc's, this one should have more than enough power to do whatever you intend on doing. Now, I'm going to try and repair this trimmer. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. I don't know how much it was used in the 3 years since I last saw it, but I will say it looks almost exactly the same, except the trimmer line has changed color, which means they did use it. The original plan for this trimmer was that it was going to be used to clear tall grass around a pond they have so they can safely fish it. One of the complaints my coworker has is with the pole handle. As you can see, it's broken, so once we get this working again, I will replace it. One small tip for someone looking to do this kind of work is to not buy the parts for the machine until you have it working again. Of course, I'm talking about the accessories that don't directly relate to the engine. Now, the purge bulb and the fuel lines have started to discolor, which is not an issue, but the bigger problem is that if ethanol fuel was put into the tank, these components could start to harden and crack. The lines have started to get a little bit hard and no longer seal to the tank, which is going to cause a leak, which means we'll need to replace them. The first thing I'm going to do is slowly pull on the rope to gauge if the engine has some compression. Now, to get a better idea, I would recommend using a compression tester instead, but this works okay if you don't have a tester on you. Now, I can feel the engine fighting back, and it's quite a lot, which means it hasn't worn out in the last 3 years. Once I know the engine is not worn out, I'm going to see if it will start and run after I put some mixed fuel into the carb's throat. If it doesn't run, it means either it doesn't have spark or the compression is too low for the engine to run. Luckily, it started and ran for a few seconds, which is great news. That means we have two of the major components for a running engine, which is spark and compression, and we only need to get the fuel system working again. Just out of curiosity, I wonder if it'll start and run on its own. You never know, maybe it didn't start for them because they flooded the engine with too much fuel trying to start it. Unfortunately, while purging the air out of the fuel system and trying to get the fuel to the carb, I can see we have a huge problem. The fuel is not getting to the carb and it's having a hard time pulling it from the tank. If the fuel doesn't make it to the carb, the engine is not going to start. That means we need to get the carb off the engine so we can service it. Now, if you think you have a problem with your carb and you know the engine runs fine, I would just consider buying a new carb instead. The reason is that some people may not want to bother trying to work on the carb, and besides that, new carbs are very affordable and mostly reliable. I think I've only ever had problems with only a few of them. Since I'm here, I'm also going to work on the fuel lines, which on this model is really easy because of the design of the tank. There's plenty of room to remove and replace the lines. On top of that, it also makes filming the repair a lot easier. The line size I'll be using is 3/16 of an inch, and although it's not Tygon line, this yellow fuel line is much better than the clear line when it comes to ethanol resistance. The first line I'm going to run will be the one for the fuel filter. It doesn't matter which line you install first or which of the openings you use, that's up to you. After cutting the angle piece off, I'm going to install the old fuel filter right after I clean it up a little bit. If your filter is clogged with old 2-stroke oil or varnished gasoline, I would consider replacing these filters because they're very affordable. And before you ask, no, you cannot use the clear lines or the air bubble stones from your aquarium for the fuel system, and that's because they're not designed for this type of use. Once the fuel filter has been installed, I'll then use the same method for the return line. I like to leave at least an inch of line in the tank, but you can put as much in as you want. Now, you don't have to cut the angle piece off either, so I'm choosing not to. Once the new fuel lines have been installed, I'm now going to focus on the carb. The first part I like to remove is the pumping side, starting with the purge bulb. Once the fasteners are off, we can then remove the retaining plate along with the old bulb. After taking off the pump, we can see the pumping diaphragm and the main body of the carb. The first thing I want to check is the round inlet screen for any dirt or debris, which as you can see, there is some here. If this screen gets covered with debris, it will stop fuel from entering the carb and keep the engine from getting any fuel. Now I got most of it out, but we'll need to check the fuel flow through the screen, which means we'll need to remove a metal plate to get to the metering diaphragm. Now the diaphragm is supposed to be soft and flexible like part of a t-shirt, but as you can hear, this one is stiff and petrified. In fact, it started breaking while I was tapping on it. We need to carefully replace this one with one that looks like it and has a stem in the middle that's just the same. Now the stems can either be long or short, and this one happens to be the shorter one. After removing what's left of the old diaphragm, I'm going to test the flow by putting fuel into the pocket for the screen and then pressing the rocker arm on the side where the metering diaphragm was at. When this happens, the needle will lift off the seat and allow the fuel to flow through the screen and past the seat, and the fuel should disappear from the pocket. However, if the fuel doesn't disappear, you'll have to clean the screen with brake or carb cleaner until it passes through the screen. Ours is working like it should, so next I'm going to inspect the pumping diaphragm. What I'm looking for is that these two check valve flaps are flat and parallel with the rest of the diaphragm. The easiest way to do that is to look at it from the side. Now this one is fine, so I'm going to reuse it. So here's the replacement diaphragm I'm going to use. If you need one of these, there should be a link in the description. Now these are about $6 after shipping if you buy a single, but if you buy a multi-pack, each one could be as little as $1 to $2. Now, at this point, I'm ready to start putting the carb back together. Now, depending upon how much cleaning you have to do to the carb, rebuilding it could take as little as 5 minutes, but of course, if it's really dirty, it could take a lot longer. The prices for the bulbs are about the same as the diaphragms. They're about $5 for a single, and the more you buy, the cheaper each will be. Just be careful because these come in different sizes, and this one is the larger one. Once the carb is back together, we can then install it back onto the engine. Now, if you like replacing your fuel lines and servicing your carb each and every year, be sure to leave ethanol mixed fuel in your trimmer for a very long time and don't use it for at least a year. The chances of this happening will be very good. However, if you want to be able to restart your trimmer each and every spring with little to no fuss, keep the fuel fresh and periodically start the trimmer once a month during its storage, either short term and especially for the long term. Before I finish installing the carb, I want to make sure that fuel is going to flow through the lines like they're supposed to. Now when pressing the bulb, fuel will come up the filter line and make its way to the carb. It will then try to fill up the bulb and then leave the carb through the return line to go back to the tank. Remember, this is only when pressing the bulb. It doesn't do this while it's running. I know it's a bit hard to tell, but the fuel is flowing through the lines just like they're supposed to. That means I can now finish installing the carb. Now, once the carb is back together, we can't start it just yet because there's still one more thing we need to take care of, and we're going to need either a new part or one from a parts machine. Of course, I'm talking about the pull handle. Luckily, I have one of these in the shed that I'm using for parts, and it's got exactly what I need. Now, to take the handle off, all we need to do is cut the knot off the rope and it will come right off. However, if we do that, the rope will then disappear into the cover as if the rope just broke, which will then cause yet another problem. Well, I don't think I've ever had to fix one of these, so I guess I'll just cut it and deal with it at a later time. Of course, we'll do the same for the recipient trimmer, except this time I don't want the rope to disappear into the cover, so I'll wrap it around a screwdriver instead and then cut the knot off. After that, I'll then install the used handle and then melt the cut end to keep it from fraying. After melting the cut end, I'll then put a knot on the rope and then remove the screwdriver. Now, I could have installed any type of pull handle that I wanted, but since I had an exact replacement, I used it instead. Now, I'm going to remove the filter cover so it'll be easier to show you the adjusting screws. The L screw is closer to the engine and it's for adjusting fuel flow at idle speed and while squeezing the trigger. Now, the screw closer to the filter base is the H screw and it's for adjusting fuel flow once the trigger has been fully squeezed. Now, when adding fuel or taking it away from the engine, this could cause the engine's idle speed to change, so this Phillips head screw close to the bulb is for adjusting the idle speed. Now, once I put the cover back on, it's finally time to start the engine and see if we need to make any adjustments. So what I did was turn the H screw counterclockwise to give the engine more fuel, and after squeezing the trigger, the engine ran much better. I then turned the H screw left and right to find when the engine was at its highest speed, but we can't leave it like that, otherwise the engine will burn up. So I like to turn the H screw about a quarter turn counterclockwise so it runs slightly rich. There's also a problem with the choke lever. Once the lever is moved to the start position and the engine starts, when you squeeze the trigger, it's supposed to automatically turn off the choke, but it's not doing that. In fact, it looks like the lever might be broken, so we'll need to take it off and find out why it's not working like it should. After prying the lever off from the shaft, you can see where the shaft goes looks just fine and the flat portion is not damaged. What that means is that the lever won't stay far enough down onto the shaft where it's supposed to engage it. Now the fix for this is to keep the lever from moving off of this part of the shaft, so I'm going to glue it into place. Now the lever is engaging the shaft just fine, but it keeps moving to a place on the shaft where it won't engage it. The glue is only used to keep the lever where it needs to be. I'm going to use a 2-part epoxy to help keep the lever from moving off the shaft, but any type of quick setting glue should work as well. After about 15 minutes, what's left over of the epoxy is setting up very well, which means this lever isn't going to come off unless I want it to. Another reason why this engine wouldn't start is that it could be flooded with fuel from repeated failed starts. If that happens, take out the spark plug and pull on the rope several times and then let it sit like that for a few hours. Then come back and pull the rope again, replace the plug, and then try starting it, but don't use the choke and keep the throttle lever fully squeezed. So in the end, this poor trimmer looks to have been stored with fuel in the tank for a very long time, which then destroyed the fuel lines and more importantly the metering diaphragm, which then didn't allow fuel to even get to the carb in the first place. So my question is, do you even worry about properly storing your equipment when you're not using them, or do you just hang it up and never think about it again until you need it? Personally, I do worry, but since I use 100% gasoline that's also been stabilized to help reduce the possibility, I don't worry about as much as I used to. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.